Lazarus was more than just a man from Bethany. He was the friend Jesus loved, the beloved brother of Martha and Mary, and the protagonist of one of the most extraordinary stories ever told. His seemingly ordinary life was transformed by a miracle that defied all barriers of human understanding. In a scenario of mourning, pain, and apparent defeat, Lazarus became the living symbol of God's power and the hope that is reborn when everything seems lost. This is the story of a man who stepped out of the shadows of death to walk among the living again, carrying with him lessons that have spanned the centuries and continue to inspire the world. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. In a small village called Bethany, hidden among peaceful hills and fields of olive trees that bowed in the wind, Lazarus was born. He was the younger brother of Martha and Mary, two women known for their generosity and wisdom. The family lived in a simple house with light stone walls that reflected the heat of the sun and a table that always seemed to have room for someone else. From an early age, Lazarus was a curious boy, one of those who liked to hear stories from travelers who passed through the village and who, without realizing it, already carried the first signs of a special calling. Bethany was a peculiar place. Despite its simplicity, it seemed to have an aura of something beyond the ordinary. The village was just a few kilometers from Jerusalem, but it seemed removed from the hustle and bustle of the big city, as if it was saved for special moments. Maybe that was why Jesus loved going there so much. He did not seek luxury or crowds. He preferred the peace of that house where he was treated as part of the family. For Lazarus, the master was more than a friend. He was like an older brother, someone who brought with him not only words of wisdom, but also a presence that soothed the soul. Life seemed to go on peacefully in Bethany. Lazarus grew up surrounded by love and the simple faith that the villagers shared. However, there was something about him that no one could explain. A serenity that didn't seem of this world, a silent confidence that overflowed even in difficult moments. He was not a man of big words, but to those who knew him, his actions said it all. Little did he know that it's true. That would transform the history of his village. The days in Bethany had their own rhythm, a cadence that makes the sound of children's laughter, the members' praise, dissonant of screaming, and the music that cuts their passing on the dirt road. It was in this simplicity that Jesus, on his journeys, found a place to rest. The house of Lazarus, Maria, and Martha had something special, a warmth that went beyond the stone walls and the fresh bread on the table. There, Jesus was not the master followed by crowds, but a dear friend, welcomed with hugs, stories, and smiles. For Lazarus, each visit was a gift. He listened to Jesus talk about the kingdom of God, about love and forgiveness, like someone listening to a melody they already know, but always discovering something new. Jesus' words were not just spoken, they seemed to create vivid images in the heart. Maria, always at the Master's feet, absorbed every detail, while Martha, practical as she was, hurried to prepare everything, sometimes grumbling about the work. Lazarus, in turn, was in the middle of this, balancing the silence of those who listen and the hospitality of those who want the other to feel at home. But it wasn't just the home that made Bethany special to Jesus. The village, with its almost mystical tranquility, seemed to reflect the greater purpose he carried. Every time Jesus left for another city, there was a strange feeling that hung in the air. As if, when he left behind more than memories, leave seeds that would one day sprout into something much bigger. For Lazarus, these comings and goings of the Master were a reminder that his life was intertwined with something greater than he could imagine. Lazarus was a man of few words, but his presence always filled the spaces around him. He wasn't the type to give big speeches or stand out in crowds. He had something more subtle, a kind of serenity that seemed to infect whoever was around. It was as if, in the silence, he found a strength that many sought in great deeds. Those who knew him knew that he had a different faith, not displayed, but lived as naturally as breathing. When Martha and Mary debated household issues or spoke enthusiastically about Jesus' visits, Lazarus listened attentively. Sometimes he gave a slight smile, as if he already understood the essence of it all, even without needing to add anything. He was the kind of person who, when offering help, made any weight seem lighter. It was there, in simple, everyday actions, that he demonstrated his spirituality without fanfare, but always present. For many in the village, Lazarus was a trusted figure. When someone needed advice or a helping hand, he was there. It wasn't because he sought recognition, but because he seemed to understand that life was made up of these silent gestures that changed everything. Maria said that her brother had a heart as big as the hills that surrounded Bethany, and Martha, even with her more practical way, knew she could count on him in the most difficult moments. It was impossible to look at Lazarus and not feel that he had a special connection with the divine, even if he never spoke of it openly. There was a calm that surrounded him, as if he already knew something that others were still trying to understand. But that calm would be put to the test. Something was about to happen, something that would bring out the depths of his faith and put the fate of his life and those around him at stake. Everything seemed to follow its natural course in Bethany until the shadow of something unexpected began to hover over Lazarus's house. It was an ordinary day when he started to feel a strange tiredness, something that didn't go away with rest or food. At first, no one paid much attention. Maybe it was the heat or the result of days of working in the sun. But, little by little, what seemed simple began to turn into concern. His face lost color, the energy that always accompanied him was fading, and the sparkle in his eyes gave way to deep tiredness. Martha and Maria took turns at his side, caring as best they could, trying to hide their concern with encouraging smiles. But deep down, they knew something serious was happening. When they realized that the situation was getting worse, they decided to send a message to Jesus. He was in another city, but they knew he would come. After all, he was not only a dear friend, but also the only one capable of bringing healing where medicine failed. The message was simple, but it carried all the urgency his words could express. "Lord, the one you love is sick." The sisters trusted that Jesus would understand. And how could I not understand? He loved Lazarus like a brother. But the days began to pass, and the Master did not arrive. The silence became heavy, and every hour seemed like an eternity. Martha tried to keep busy, while Mary, more introspective, looked at the horizon as if expecting to see the figure of Jesus appearing on the road at any moment. But instead, Lazarus's illness worsened. The fever consumed him, and his strength seemed to disappear like water running through his fingers. The inevitable began to become real, and their hope was put to the test. Something incomprehensible was happening, something that defied even the most solid faith. The day that everyone feared arrived like a blow that no one wanted to face. Lazarus, the dear brother, the silent and always present friend, closed his eyes for the last time. Martha and Maria, despite having already felt the foreshadowing of this moment, were not prepared for the void it left. The room he was in, which had previously seemed full of life, now seemed larger, colder, as if the air refused to circulate. The news spread quickly throughout Bethany. Friends, neighbors, and relatives began to arrive, bringing words of comfort, hugs, and shared tears. The mourning in Lazarus' house seemed to echo throughout the village, like a collective grief. Some commented in hushed voices about how sad it was that Jesus had not arrived in time. Others shook their heads, resigned, as if to say, "It's what was destined." But deep down, everyone wondered, why didn't the Master come? Martha, always practical, dealt with her pain by organizing preparations for the burial, while Maria, devastated, could barely leave where she was. Lazarus' body was wrapped in linen cloths and taken to the tomb, a cave excavated in the rock, as was the custom at the time. A large stone was rolled to close the entrance, sealing not only Lazarus's body, but also the dreams and hopes of his sisters. The days that followed were slow, shrouded in silence. The voices of people coming to pay their respects seemed distant, like a murmur in the background. Martha and Mary tried to make sense of their loss, but Jesus' absence weighed heavily on their minds and hearts. And then, just when it seemed like all was lost, someone whispered, "He's coming." The words arrived like a bolt of lightning, cutting through the stillness of pain. But was there still anything to be done? When the words reached Martha's ears, something inside her lit up, mixing pain with hope that she barely dared to feel. "He's coming." Jesus was finally on his way. There was no time for hesitation. Martha, always determined, left the house and went to meet the Master. His steps were quick, but his heart seemed even faster, pounding with a mixture of expectation and a whirlwind of questions. When he saw him on the road, his voice came out before he could contain it. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." It was not a confrontation, but a confession of faith filled with pain. She knew who he was. She knew what he could do, but still she couldn't avoid the weight of his absence in the most difficult moments. Despite this, he continued, "But I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you." It was as if, even in the midst of sadness, Martha held on to the last spark of confidence she had. Jesus looked at her with a serenity that seemed to cut through all that pain. "Your brother will rise again," he said, his words so firm they seemed to echo in the hills. Martha nodded, her eyes still clouded by tears. She knew about the promises of resurrection at the end of time, but it seemed so distant, so disconnected from the reality of what had just happened. Maria, in turn, was still at home, surrounded by grief. When she received the news that Jesus was calling her, she suddenly stood up. Her feet carried her to him, and her tears said what words could not. "Lord, if you had been here," was all he could say, before collapsing in tears at his feet. When he saw Mary crying, and everyone around her too, something deep moved Jesus. His eyes filled with tears. The Savior, the Master, the Son of God, wept. But in the midst of that moment of shared pain, something was about to happen. He who cried in the face of human suffering also carried the power to transform it. Jesus walked to the tomb of Lazarus, followed by Martha, Mary, and a crowd that had gathered. The air was heavy, and the sound of footsteps mixed with the murmur of people, as if even nature was holding its breath. The tomb was there, a cave sealed by a large stone, marking the end that everyone believed to be definitive. It was impossible to look at that rock and not feel the weight of grief, as if it were a wall between the living and the dead. When they arrived at the tomb, Jesus stopped. His gaze swept the place, as if seeing something beyond what the eyes could reach. "Take away the stone," he said, his voice clear and decisive, cutting through the tension like a blade. The request was met with murmurs and incredulous looks. Martha, trying to deal with the shock, replied hesitantly, "Sir, it already smells bad, as it is already the 4th day." His words carried not only physical reality, but also the weight of a hope that was beginning to dissolve. But Jesus, with a calm that seemed out of place in the midst of that scenario, replied, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" There was something in his voice, a certainty that seemed to have the power to suspend time, to capture the attention of everyone present. Some men approached and, with effort, began to move the stone. The sound of her rolling was almost deafening in the silence that had taken over the place. Everyone's eyes were fixed on that dark space that was opening up. Jesus raised his eyes to heaven and prayed, thanking the Father before he even acted. The crowd, now completely silent, waited. The impossible was lurking, and the air seemed charged with something no one could explain. Then, with a voice that reverberated like thunder, he shouted, "Lazarus, come out!" Those words echoed across the valley, crossing time and space, leaving everyone in an expectation that seemed impossible to bear. The silence that followed Jesus' call was almost palpable. Everyone held their breath, their eyes fixed on the darkness that now opened before them. Some looked at the tomb with disbelief, others with a glimmer of hope that they barely dared to admit. The air was charged, as if the land itself was waiting to see what would happen. Suddenly, a soft sound came from inside the cave. It was difficult to tell what it was. Perhaps a movement, the rustling of fabrics. People looked at each other, as if seeking confirmation of what they were hearing. Then something happened that no one would ever forget. A figure began to emerge from the opening of the tomb. It was Lazarus. He was wrapped in the linen swaddling clothes that had been used to prepare his body, like a traveler returning from a long journey. Martha and Maria's eyes widened, and for a moment they stood still, as if what they saw couldn't be real. But there he was, his brother, the same Lazarus they had mourned and buried. His figure seemed like a living miracle, a symbol of what no one believed possible. The crowd erupted in murmurs and exclamations of astonishment. Some walked away, afraid of what they saw, while others fell to their knees, amazed at the power they had just witnessed. "Untie him and let him go," Jesus said calmly, as if ordering a man back to life was a natural thing. Lazarus' friends ran to help him, removing the bandages that wrapped him. His skin was warm, his eyes clear and alive, as if death had never touched his soul. While the people around were still trying to understand what had just happened, the news began to spread. Lazarus was alive, and with that, Jesus' fame spread even further. But not everyone viewed this miracle favorably. In the dark corridors of Jerusalem, religious leaders began to plan something that would change the course of events. The resurrection of Lazarus was not just a miracle. It was like a stone thrown into calm waters, creating waves that spread throughout the region. The people who were present that afternoon rushed to tell what they had witnessed, each with their own way of describing the impossible. Some spoke with exalted voices, others still trembled as they remembered the moment when Lazarus emerged from the tomb, alive before their eyes. The streets of Bethany and Jerusalem were soon filled with murmurs and exclamations. "He called a dead man back to life." Meanwhile, Lazarus, Martha, and Maria tried to return to normality. But how to return to the life before, when everything had changed? The family home became a meeting point for the curious, faithful, and skeptics. Some came just to see Lazarus with their own eyes, as if they needed to confirm that he was really real. Others arrived with questions, trying to understand what it was like to be on the other side and what had happened when he heard the voice of Jesus calling him. But not everyone saw that with eyes of faith. In Jerusalem, religious leaders began to worry. The name of Jesus was everywhere, and the miracle of Lazarus was like a drum echoing louder every day. For them, this was not just a sign of God's power, but a direct threat to their position and the control they exercised over the people. Lazarus, now alive, was more than a resurrected man. He was living proof of Jesus' authority, and that was something they could not accept. In secret meetings, while the city slept, voices rose from the shadows. "If we let him continue like this, everyone will believe in him," they said. And then, in a darker tone, someone suggested not only Jesus, but also Lazarus. He needs to be silenced. The conspiracy began to take shape, a plot that not only threatened the master, but also the one who had just received a new chance at life. Lazarus, now a living figure of a miracle that no one could ignore, became more than a man. He was a testimony. With every step he took through the streets of Bethany or Jerusalem, eyes followed him, some with admiration, others with disbelief, and some even with fear. How could someone who was dead walk among the living again? For many, he was tangible proof of Jesus' power. For others, an uncomfortable reminder that the control they thought they had over their people was slipping away. Martha and Maria, despite being relieved and grateful for their brother's return, began to feel the tension growing around them. It wasn't just curiosity that drew people to his home. There was also the shadow of something darker, the whispered conversations, the furtive glances. Everything indicated that Lazarus's life, returned to him in such a miraculous way, was now in danger. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because his very existence was a challenge to those who opposed Jesus. In Jerusalem, religious leaders continued to conspire. Lazarus was not just a resurrected man, he was a living threat, proof no one could refute. For them, as long as Lazarus was there, every word of Jesus would gain even more strength. And so, in the midst of turmoil and fear, they began to plan his death as well. Silencing Lazarus was, for them, as urgent as silencing Jesus himself. But while this was happening, Lazarus continued to live. In every encounter, in every look he exchanged with those who came to him, there was a clear message. He was not just the man who came back to life. He was someone who knew the fragility of existence and experienced the restorative power of God. His life was a constant reminder that the impossible is no barrier to the divine, and that even when all seems lost, there is hope. And so, Lazarus walked, not just as a survivor, but as a living symbol of something greater, something that could not be erased, not even by the darkest conspiracy. The lessons of his life began to resonate far beyond Bethany, in hearts that sought to understand what it means to truly trust in something greater. The story of Lazarus did not end with his resurrection, nor with the conspiracies that formed around him. She continues in the teachings that transcended time and in the hearts that were touched by her life. Every step he took after leaving the tomb was a testimony to the power of God and the truth that Jesus proclaimed. Lazarus didn't need words to tell his story. His very existence was a living sermon, a message that said, "Death is not the end." In every glance he met with someone else's, there was a silent exchange, as if his newly restored life was a window to something greater. He didn't just live, he inspired, reminding everyone that hope doesn't end at the grave. Lazarus's presence was a metaphor for what Jesus promised, a rebirth, a new chance, a transformed life. But the story of Lazarus also challenges us. She calls us to trust, even when everything seems lost. Martha and Mary saw death up close, experienced the pain of grief and God's apparent delay, but in the end, they discovered that divine time does not follow ours. Lazarus teaches us that even when the scenario is desperate, God is working on something that our eyes cannot yet see. And there is something else that Lazarus leaves us, the courage to live fully. After returning to life, he did not hide, even with the threats hanging over him. He faced fear with the certainty that his life had a greater purpose. Each day he lived was a celebration of God's faithfulness, a silent proclamation that the impossible is no barrier to the divine. The story of Lazarus is not just about a man who was resurrected, it's about transformation, faith in the midst of darkness, and the power of God that reaches us where we least expect it. His life, marked by miracle, continues to speak to those who seek hope, even in the darkest moments. If you like the story of Lazarus and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.